initiating central occupation claims early, establishing a firm pawn presence. Developing the knight to f6 is a flexible response, immediately contesting the center and preparing for further piece development without committing pawns too early. Establishing central control and eyeing queenside space, this advance immediately challenges black's flexible nf6. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares to launch an assault on white's center with a bishop aiming down the long diagonal, a classic Indian defense approach. Developing the knight to c3 fortifies the pawn center and prepares for castling, a sensible move that adds pressure to the queenside. Developing the bishop to this diagonal solidifies the fianchetto and prepares for central pawn breaks or queenside expansion. Embracing the center, white boldly stakes a claim for central domination, preparing rapid piece development. Solidifying central presence, black challenges white's e-pawn and prepares for piece development, creating a flexible pawn chain. Developing the knight to f3 neatly anchors white's center and prepares for kingside castling, adding a crucial piece to the evolving pawn structure. Securing the king is paramount, initiating a common defensive maneuver that prepares for future pawn advances. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling, this development harmonizes the pawn structure with the knight and bishop, aiming for a flexible setup that allows for future central pawn pushes or flank attacks, while simultaneously protecting the nascent kingside structure. Challenging white's central pawn structure with immediate action, this thrust forces a decision about control of the critical d4 and e4 squares, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Pivoting the bishop offers flexibility, potentially preparing a queenside expansion or rerouting the piece to a more active diagonal later, while also solidifying the d4 pawn's defense. Unifying the queen with the queenside development, this maneuver aims to support the central pawn push and prepare for potential queenside castling. Pioneering a central pawn thrust, white resolutely seizes a significant slice of the board, aiming to stifle black's developing ambitions and create a formidable pawn chain. This creates an immediate positional squeeze, forcing black to ponder how to dislodge the encroaching white soldier and reclaim active piece play. A calculated retreat, this knight repositions to a less active square, aiming to facilitate a queenside pawn advance or potentially regroup for a central counterstrike, all while safeguarding the king from immediate threats on the kingside. Initiating a pawn storm against the kingside, white aims to shatter black's defensive pawn structure and expose the monarch, potentially creating open lines for immediate attack. Exploiting the slightly backward pawn structure on the queenside, black initiates a dramatic pawn thrust, aiming to open lines against white's seemingly secure king and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. Launching a pawn spearhead like that on the kingside aims to rip open the pawn cover around black's castled king, forcing concessions and potentially creating a direct assault path, though it does leave the white king's immediate vicinity somewhat less defended. Unleashing a pawn storm with this aggressive advance, black seeks to disrupt white's central control and pry open attacking lanes, a bold gambit that could lead to a sharp, unbalanced position where both kings become targets. White retreats the bishop, not to avoid immediate threats, but to consolidate and prepare for a more patient buildup, potentially redeploying it to a more active diagonal or even supporting a future kingside pawn push. This maneuver subtly acknowledges black's aggressive pawn advance by creating a more resilient defensive structure and seeking to undermine black's central influence through positional play rather than direct confrontation. Pushing the pawn forward aggressively, black immediately confronts white's kingside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt the existing harmony and potentially open lines for future counterplay, even at the cost of weakening the pawn on g5 itself. Unleashing the h-pawn further creates a dynamic rift in the kingside pawn structure, deliberately inviting confrontation and potentially opening critical lines towards black's vulnerable monarch as the knight on f6, now awkwardly placed and somewhat isolated, finds its support network compromised. The bishop now retreats to a more robust diagonal, shoring up the kingside and eyeing potential central breaks, while preparing for a more active role in the ensuing pawn skirmishes. A bold gambit of mobility, sacrificing pawn structure for a potential knight outpost, and a daring flanking maneuver toward black's kingside. This advance heralds an aggressive intent, aiming to disrupt black's solid pawn wall and exploit any resulting weaknesses, transforming the typically static kingside into a dynamic battleground. By repositioning the knight, white invites a tactical skirmish, potentially creating lines of attack or even a powerful knight fork as the board opens up. The knight's relocation to h2 hints at a deeper plan, perhaps intending to support a f4-f5 push or to reroute the knight to a more active square like f3 or g4, keeping black guessing. This seemingly passive repositioning subtly increases pressure on black's f4 pawn, forcing a reevaluation of the pawn chain's integrity and the defender's coordination. Safeguarding the monarch from the advancing pawn storm and the open king's file is paramount, a proactive measure ensuring the king isn't exposed to immediate threats. Suddenly, the bishop on g4 seizes control of the diagonal, eyeing the pinned knight on e8 and threatening to disrupt black's pawn shield. Opening the g-file to challenge white's knight on h2 creates immediate dynamic possibilities, although it simultaneously exposes black's king and weakens the pawn structure around it. The knight's repositioning opens a diagonal for the queen and aims to occupy a more active central square, though it leaves the kingside pawns somewhat isolated. Black reinforces the central pawn chain's integrity, a subtle yet vital act of consolidation in this tense position, aiming to solidify the king's shelter while eyeing potential counterplay on the kingside. Unleashing the queen towards the kingside aims to leverage the advanced pawn mass, creating immediate threats against black's somewhat exposed monarch while potentially opening lines for white's rooks to join the fray. Black's rook on g8 immediately fortifies the g-file, creating a potential avenue for a counterattack against white's king, which is currently exposed by the advanced pawns. This proactive positioning suggests a desire to contest the open file and perhaps launch a kingside assault, a common theme when the center is locked and queenside play is limited. The rook's new outpost also subtly prepares for potential piece exchanges on the g-file, which could further weaken white's pawn structure or open lines towards the white monarch. Castling queenside immediately initiates a sharp race for territory, signaling white's intent to exploit the kingside space advantage and unleash attacking potential against black's somewhat cramped position. Intriguing maneuver, intending to dislodge the formidable bishop and reclaim space on the kingside, though it temporarily abandons the central dark squares and invites further penetration down the g-file. Unleashing a potent kingside pawn storm, white aims to shatter black's defensive structure and expose the monarch, creating immediate attacking opportunities. Black's pawn push on c5 dramatically reshapes the central landscape, aiming to undermine white's e4 pawn and create counterplay on the queenside. This move accepts a structural alteration, potentially weakening the d5 square, but in exchange opens avenues for the queen and bishop, seeking to disrupt white's kingside intentions. It's a bold attempt to seize the initiative and prevent white from fully consolidating their spatial advantage. Focusing on the kingside development, white initiates a centralizing maneuver, preparing to support the queenside advance with the king's rook. The intention here is to generate activity on the queenside while solidifying white's central grip, as the d5 pawn stands firm. This redeployment also aims to bring the rook into a more active defensive role, potentially reinforcing the king's security if black's kingside aggression intensifies. By shifting the rook, white is subtly repositioning forces to address the positional challenges presented by black's pawn structure and piece placement, seeking a more harmonious alignment for future operations. Black seeks to activate their dormant knight, aiming to reinforce the central d6 pawn and potentially challenge white's advanced kingside pawn structure by preparing for a future, rf6. A subtle repositioning, nd1*** prepares to pivot the knight to a more active square, likely the f2 outpost, offering better support for the kingside attack that white has been meticulously building. This maneuver sacrifices immediate central influence for long-term pressure, a common theme in King's Indian attack structures where queenside play can often be a strategic distraction from the main assault. Observe how this seemingly passive retreat actually augments the pressure on black's overextended pawn chain and potentially opens up lines for a later rook lift. The knight's journey across the board aims to exploit black's somewhat passive piece placement and the vulnerability of the dark squares around the black king. Unleashing the queen side with a pawn storm, b5* is a bold assertion of counterplay, aiming to shatter white's central pawn structure and exploit the exposed nature of the bishop on g4. Shifting the queen to e2 aims to reinforce the kingside pawn storm's momentum and potentially prepare for a queenside counterplay involving the rooks, but it surrenders the critical e-file's control, a potential launching pad for black's counterattack with the discovered pressure from the rook on g8. Black carves open a crucial diagonal for his bishop, aiming to unravel the queenside and exploit white's slightly uncoordinated pieces, while simultaneously accepting a structural concession in the pawn chain to gain dynamic counterplay. Snatching the pawn on c4 injects a much-needed dose of aggression into white's queenside play, disrupting black's nascent counterplay and creating immediate threats against the unprotected pawn structure. Black's pieces are starting to stir from their defensive shells, aiming to challenge white's spatial advantage on the queenside and break open lines for their own attack. The knight's repositioning to b6 is a cunning maneuver designed to exploit the newly created queenside pawn structure after the exchange on c4, potentially targeting the c4 pawn or even preparing a future a5 advance to gain a foothold. This move signifies a shift in black's strategy from defending their king to proactively seeking counterplay, a crucial development when faced with a more centralized and aggressive opponent. Relinquishing the queen's diagonal pressure, white intentionally pulls the queen back to a less active square, a strategic concession perhaps aimed at preventing tactical skirmishes or preparing a subtle repositioning, all while acknowledging black's recent pawn advances have indeed carved out useful space. Black boldly injects a new attacking thrust on the queenside, seeking to unravel the compact pawn structure and create counterplay before white's own initiative on the kingside fully materializes. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure becomes paramount, as white sacrifices immediate attacking dynamism for a more robust defensive posture, preparing to potentially anchor the kingside against black's encroaching queenside initiative. Black reorganizes the queen, seeking to connect the rooks and prepare a potential counterstrike on the queenside or centralize the monarch's defense. Reclaiming central influence, the knight aims to reposition from the passive third rank, seeking an active square on either d5 or e4 to challenge black's entrenched pawn structure and potentially support a kingside initiative or a central breakthrough. This maneuver attempts to broaden black's influence on the queenside, potentially preparing to contest the open c-file or support a further pawn advance with b5-b4, while simultaneously adding a bit more oxygen to the king's position. Reinforcing the king's pawn shield and preparing a potential pawn storm advance on the kingside, this maneuver subtly aims to restrict black's queenside expansion and create more space for white's own pieces to operate. Black's bishop retreats to its starting square, a remarkably passive redeployment that suggests a desire to avoid immediate tactical exchanges and perhaps reevaluate its influence, though this does little to contest white's growing control of the central dark squares. Pushing the rook to the g-file, the audacious plan to pry open the kingside gains momentum, seeking to exploit any lingering weakness in black's castled position through relentless pressure. A defensive posture taken here, consolidating the knight and seeking to bring it to a potentially more active square later, but it does little to address white's growing queenside pressure and control of the g-file. Shifting the queen to f1 aims to connect the rooks and prepare for potential activity on the kingside, perhaps supporting a knight leap to g5 or a pawn push to g4. Seeking to untangle its pieces and activate the f8 rook, this maneuver aims to redeploy the minor piece to a more dynamic square, potentially supporting an advance on the kingside or offering a conduit for piece exchanges to simplify the complex central structure. Unleashing the g-file rook, white injects immediate dynamism, aiming to exploit the potential for a sudden attack down that open column. Relocating the knight to f6 injects activity into black's position, directly challenging white's dominant knight on g4 and initiating a potential counterplay on the king side. Unleashing a pawn storm's fury through the capture, white injects dynamism into the center, potentially opening lines for attack, though it risks weakening their own structure for this aggression. Unleashing a tempestuous counterattack, this capture shatters white's pawn chain, opening a diagonal for black's dark-squared bishop and immediately posing new tactical questions. Liberating the knight opens a crucial diagonal for the queen and aims to exploit black's slightly passive knight placement on f6. Reclaiming the bishop to its most active diagonal revitalizes black's queenside potential, eyeing weaknesses created by white's advancing pawns and preparing to contest the newly opened lines. Sacrificing the rook on g6 immediately opens lines and aims to break black's defensive structure around their king, even though it costs material. Unraveling the pawn's structure now opens crucial lines, potentially turning the tide of this complex struggle. Unleashing the queenside pawn majority becomes the immediate priority, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and create dynamic play before the material imbalance on the kingside solidifies further. Seeking to reposition the king and consolidate the pawn structure after the rook exchange, this retreat acknowledges the lack of immediate threats to its current square and prepares for potential future defensive maneuvers. Initiating a methodical repositioning of the knight to a more central and active square, the knight embarks on a journey to d1, aiming to potentially support a queenside initiative or bolster the kingside defense, depending on black's subsequent reactions and white's evolving strategic goals. Injecting a dynamic knight into the center, this maneuver aims to exploit the newly opened lines and challenge white's pawn structure. Navigating the knight towards the queenside opens up promising outpost possibilities. The bishop retreats, a sentinel abandoning its forward post, surrendering valuable central influence to shore up the beleaguered kingside structure. Deploying the knight to c4 aims to establish a powerful outpost, pressuring the queenside pawns and potentially disrupting black's pawn structure, while also preparing for a future advance on the queenside or a maneuver to the center. Shifting the queen to d7 initiates a flexible regrouping, eyeing potential pressure along the newly opened d-file and preparing for future pawn advances on the queenside. Unleashing the bishop to the edge of the board aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially target weak pawns or squares, while also freeing up the file for white's rook later in the game. The knight gallops forward, a charging beast seeking to control the crucial d4 square and disrupt white's carefully constructed queenside blockade, while simultaneously opening avenues for potential counterplay through the center. Fortifying the queenside structure now allows for potential kingside pawn advances, a crucial shift given the cramped nature of white's king position. The knight lunges forward, a bold sortie to b5, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed kingside pawn chain and exploit the pressure on the c3 square. This maneuver challenges white's queenside pawn majority and attempts to create counterplay by activating a piece that has been somewhat passive. It's a dynamic choice, seeking to trade off white's more advanced knight on c3 and open lines for black's own pieces. The risk, however, is that this knight might become exposed to white's attacking forces if not adequately supported, potentially becoming a target rather than a savior. The bishop repositions, abandoning the pin and seeking a more active diagonal, a shrewd maneuver to bolster the queenside's defenses while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial open files that are beginning to emerge. Repositioning the bishop back to d8, the black forces are somewhat adrift, with no immediate threats or clear coordination. The entire structure seems to be lacking a cohesive plan, and this bishop's journey so far has yielded little territorial gain or positional advantage. One wonders if a more proactive deployment, perhaps aiming for the e7 square or even directly supporting potential pawn advances on the queenside, might have been a more energetic choice. The current setup feels passive, allowing white ample opportunity to consolidate and press their positional advantage. Opening the queenside pawns with this advance creates immediate counterplay, forcing black to decide how to address the potential disruption of their pawn structure and the opening of lines for white's rooks. The knight's retreat to the edge of the board might seem passive, but it strategically repositions this piece to a more active role, potentially targeting the c6 square or supporting a pawn advance on the queen side, while simultaneously avoiding tactical lines that might arise from staying in the center. Positioning the bishop to c3 solidifies control over the d4-h8 diagonal, creating a crucial outpost and preparing a potential advance of the pawn, while simultaneously defending against black's advanced knight on a7, which might otherwise explore b5 or c6. A bold gambit to challenge white's imposing pawn chain, accepting significant material risk for potential counterplay. Sacrificing the bishop opens a vital diagonal for the queen, directly threatening the vulnerable enemy king and potentially unleashing a devastating attack along the 7th rank. Capturing the advanced pawn initiates a dynamic shift, sacrificing a bit of pawn structure for immediate central presence and opening lines that could favor your remaining pieces, particularly the queen. The knight's relocation to e5 seizes central space, creating an immediate threat to the unprotected pawn on d6 and potentially opening lines for white's remaining pieces. Reclaiming the initiative, black seeks to disrupt white's aggressive pawn structure by attacking the advanced e5 pawn, which, while strong, now requires significant support, potentially straining white's pieces. A tactical skirmish erupts, forcing a swift reassessment of piece activity as white's knight aggressively probes for weaknesses on the queen side. Finally shifting the queen from its somewhat passive defensive post, this redeployment aims to activate her on the king side and explore potential avenues of attack, possibly supporting a pawn push or preparing to join a coordinated assault. Regaining the pawn offers a material advantage, but this move consolidates white's central control and prepares to activate the rook on the g-file, creating potential threats against the black king. Reactivating the knight to its central outpost offers a chance to challenge white's imposing rook on the 7th rank and contest the open g-file. Reasserting pressure on the f-file after the exchange of pawns, this repositioning readies white to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's king, aiming to create opportunities for piece activity or pawn advances to break through the defensive structure. Reasserting central influence and aiming to exploit the potential weakness on the c4 square, this maneuver prepares to contest crucial diagonals and potentially activate the knight on its way to a more central outpost. Sacrificing the queen opens up a direct assault on black's exposed king, aiming to create mating threats with the rook and bishop acting in concert. Recapturing with the bishop attempts to solidify the center, but it surrenders the open e-file and passively awaits white's decisive pawn push. Initiating a counterattack on the queen side, this move seeks to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and exploit the open diagonal now available to white's queen. A desperate gambit, attempting to unravel white's queenside advantage by introducing counterplay through material sacrifice. Reclaiming that central pawn opens up the queenside for white's pieces to operate more freely, potentially forcing concessions from black's currently cramped structure. Unveiling the threatened queen, this gambit forces white to confront the immediate danger, potentially disrupting their carefully constructed pawn majority on the queen side. Securing the king on its new square offers breathing room, preventing immediate checks and allowing for a more organized defense while white consolidates their material advantage and prepares to exploit the open files. Reactivating the queen to this square on the 3rd rank suddenly offers a glimmer of hope, creating a potential avenue for counterplay along the open h-file and eyeing the isolated white pawns on the king side, even as white's pieces maintain a suffocating positional grip. Disengaging the queen from the central pressure allows for a regrouping, aiming to reinforce the weakened king side and explore counterplay on the queen side with the newfound space. Retreating the queen to safety is a sensible reaction, recognizing the immediate threat to its position. This move underscores the importance of keeping the queen active and protected. The game has reached a complex juncture where piece activity and pawn structure are delicately balanced. Black's queen, having been pushed around the board, now finds a more secure outpost, allowing other pieces to potentially develop their initiatives or shore up defensive weaknesses. This repositioning also subtly prepares for a potential queenside advance or reinforces the center should white's initiative falter. The king's safety remains paramount, and this queenly maneuver indirectly contributes to that by preventing any swift tactical breakthroughs from white. Bringing the king out for a promenade, this unexpected maneuver suddenly seizes the initiative, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch. The king's journey towards the center, often a risky endeavor, here aims to evade further checks and perhaps seek refuge behind its own pawns. A desperate bid to consolidate before a potential material imbalance tips the scales irrevocably. Shifting the king towards the center now aims to activate it in a likely endgame scenario, offering support to the queenside pawns while potentially blocking black's bishop from further infiltrations. Seizing the pawn on a4 opens a vital diagonal for the queen, promising immediate counterplay against white's slightly exposed monarch and threatening to unravel the pawn structure. Re-establishing control over the crucial c-file after the trade, white aims to activate the rook and potentially pressure the black king's remaining defenses. Abandoning the defense of the open b-file and the passed pawn, this retreat strategically cedes valuable territory to the opponent's rooks, potentially simplifying the position into a disadvantageous endgame where white's pawn structure and connected passers might prove decisive. Controlling the open file now becomes paramount, aiming to restrict black's bishop and potentially launch a decisive invasion. Finally, a breakthrough on the queen side, aiming to untangle your rook and create counterplay before the white pawns advance further. Unleashing a check, this move forces a decision regarding the black king's safety amidst the scattered pawns and the looming rook, potentially disrupting any nascent coordination. The black king, previously tucked away, now finds itself directly exposed to a decisive attack along the open file, a consequence of the aggressive pawn structure that has materialized. Sacrificing the pawn opens up lines toward the black king, potentially creating attacking chances. Sacrificing the rook here, a desperate attempt to disrupt the monarch's safety by creating an open line, though it ultimately seems to lead to greater material loss for black and an exposed king.